The storm outside was relentless. Rain hammered against the massive windows of the Collins estate, a fortress of glass and steel perched high above the city. The night was thick with thunder, but inside everything was still, almost too still. And then, bam! The front door slammed open, the sound echoing through the grand foyer like a gunshot. Ava Collins burst into the house, her breath ragged, her clothes soaked through. Her wild curls clung to her face, her fingers clenched so tightly around her phone that her knuckles had gone white. She was shaking, not from the cold, but from rage. At the far end of the dimly lit living room, her father, Mark Collins, billionaire CEO, restaurant mogul, and a man not easily rattled, slowly lifted his head from the glass of whiskey in his hand. He didn't flinch, didn't move. He just watched. Ava sucked in a breath, her voice tight with barely contained fury. "Dad, I heard them. In your restaurant, they—" She stopped. The words stuck in her throat. Mark set his glass down on the sleek mahogany table beside him. His eyes, cold, calculating, always 10 steps ahead of everyone else, locked onto hers. "What did you hear?" Ava swallowed hard. Her hands curled into fists at her sides. But before she could say it, before she could bring herself to rip the truth out of her chest, her mind snapped back. Back to how this all started. 3 days earlier. The chandeliers in the Collins dining room cast a golden glow over the pristine table, the air thick with the scent of rosemary and seared steak. Mark Collins sat at the head of the table, posture perfect, gaze unwavering. Across from him, Ava leaned back in her chair, arms crossed, eyes sharp. This wasn't just another family dinner. "You really think your restaurants are perfect?" she asked, one brow raised. Mark smirked. "I know they are." Ava let out a sharp laugh, shaking her head. "You ever even stepped inside one of them? Like really stepped inside, talked to the staff, seen how they're treated?" Mark exhaled, setting down his fork. "Ava, I have the best managers in the business. I hire professionals. I pay them better than most. My standards are clear. If there was a problem, I'd know." Ava leaned forward, resting her elbows on the table. "No, you'd know what they want you to know." For the first time, her father's smirk faded. She pressed on. "You sit up here in this house, in your office, making decisions like a damn king. But what if your castle is rotting from the inside? What if there are cracks you don't see?" Mark's fingers drummed against the table, a habit of his when he was thinking, calculating. Then, slowly, he sat back, tilting his head. "And what exactly are you suggesting?" Ava didn't hesitate. "Let me go in. Let me see it for myself." His brows furrowed. "You want to work in one of my restaurants?" "Yeah. Undercover. No one will know who I am. If I find nothing, fine, you win. But if I do find something, anything, then you admit you don't know everything, and you fix it." Mark's jaw tightened. For a moment, he just stared at her, unreadable as ever. Then, after a long pause, he let out a quiet chuckle. "You always did like a challenge." Ava smirked. "I learned from the best." Another beat of silence. Then Mark lifted his glass, swirling the dark liquid inside. "All right, you have 1 week." Ava's heart pounded. "Deal." The next morning, Ava Collins disappeared. She erased her name from the system, changed the records, and walked into one of her father's most prestigious restaurants, Chateau Noir, as just another waitress. And from the moment she stepped through those doors, she knew something was wrong. The second Ava walked into Chateau Noir, she felt it, that shift in the air. It wasn't the overwhelming luxury of the place, the glistening chandeliers, or the perfectly polished floors. It was something deeper, something crawling under the surface. She wasn't sure what it was yet, but she was about to find out. The moment she reached the back of the restaurant, the energy shifted again. The kitchen staff moved like a well-oiled machine, shouts and orders flying in every direction. Servers rushed in and out, balancing trays, dodging each other like trained dancers. And then there was Douglas Raines, the restaurant manager, middle-aged, white, well-dressed in the way that said he thought too highly of himself. His hair was slicked back, his tie a little too tight, and his expression screamed, "I'm the king of this castle." Ava barely had time to process before he spotted her. His eyes swept over her, dismissive. "You the new girl?" Ava straightened. "Yeah, Ava Monroe." Douglas barely nodded, already turning away. Follow me. No welcome. No handshake. Just move or get out of the way. Ava bit the inside of her cheek but said nothing. She'd dealt with men like him before, the type who saw power as a weapon. He led her to a small employee area, where a Latina woman in her 30s stood rolling silverware into napkins. She barely looked up when Douglas motioned toward her. Lisa, show her around. Don't waste too much time. And with that, he was gone. Lisa exhaled through her nose, shaking her head. He's in a mood today. Not that that's new. Ava gave a small smirk. Yeah, I got that vibe. Lisa finally looked at her, taking in her uniform, her stance, her face. There was something behind her eyes. Curiosity, maybe a little caution. You worked in places like this before? Ava nodded. Couple of years at a bistro in Brooklyn. A lie, but a believable one. Lisa snorted. Yeah? Well, forget whatever you learned there. This ain't Brooklyn. This is war. Ava raised an eyebrow. That bad? Lisa tossed a roll of silverware into a basket. Depends. You planning to keep your head down or you planning to actually give a damn? Ava tilted her head, intrigued. What happens if I give a damn? Lisa's smirk was sharp. You find out real fast who runs this place. Ava tucked that information away. The shift was brutal. This wasn't some cute little cafe where people sipped lattes and tipped extra for a smile. This was fine dining with high expectations, impatient customers, and a staff that had clearly learned how to survive in the trenches. Ava watched everything. She noticed how some servers worked double time while others, namely two white guys named Brandon and Kyle, barely lifted a finger. They laughed at private jokes, gave half-hearted service, and yet somehow no one called them out on it. She noticed how Douglas hovered, not over the worst employees, but over people like Lisa, how his eyes lingered too long, how his tone sharpened when he spoke to the Black and Latino staff but stayed almost friendly with guys like Brandon and Kyle. It wasn't outright, it wasn't obvious, but it was there. Ava kept moving, working through the shift, keeping her head down just enough, but her ears open. And then she heard it. She had just dropped off a check when she passed the kitchen doors and caught Brandon and Kyle talking near the service station. Man, I still can't believe Collins owns this place, Brandon muttered. Kyle scoffed. Yeah, well, not for long. Ava froze mid-step. Brandon smirked. You really think it's gonna work? Kyle shrugged, rolling a toothpick between his fingers. It already is. You see those Yelp reviews last week? Couple more like that and this place starts bleeding customers. And once it does, he made a dramatic little slicing motion across his throat. Game over. Ava's grip tightened on her notepad. What the hell did that mean? Brandon chuckled, tossing a rag onto the counter. I just hope Douglas comes through on his end. Kyle nodded. He will. He's got too much to lose if he doesn't. Ava's heart slammed against her ribs. She didn't know the full picture yet, but one thing was clear. They were trying to sabotage the restaurant. And Douglas was involved. She forced herself to keep walking, her mind spinning. Who were they working for? Why was Douglas risking everything? And how deep did this go? Ava's jaw tightened. She needed answers. And she was going to get them. Ava's mind was on fire. She replayed the conversation in her head. Brandon and Kyle laughing like it was all a joke, casually talking about running her father's restaurant into the ground. And Douglas? He was in on it. She didn't have all the details yet, but one thing was clear. This wasn't just bad employees being lazy. This was sabotage. Deliberate. Planned. And it went higher up than just two idiots in aprons. Ava needed proof. Hard proof. And she knew exactly where to start. The shift dragged on and Ava forced herself to act normal. She smiled at guests, took orders, refilled drinks, all while keeping her ears open and her eyes sharper than ever. Brandon and Kyle? Still slacking. They spent more time talking than working, making half-assed attempts to clean tables while the rest of the staff picked up their slack. And yet, nobody said a damn word. Lisa muttered under her breath every time she had to pick up one of their orders, but she didn't complain out loud. Neither did the other servers, because they all knew. Brandon and Kyle? Untouchable. Ava wanted to grab them both by their collars and shake the truth out of them, but she wasn't stupid. If she made a move too soon, she'd tip them off. She needed to play this smart. By the time the last guests had left and the restaurant was winding down, Ava finally had an opening. She spotted Jordan, the young black busboy who had seen her eavesdropping earlier. He was stacking plates near the back, his expression unreadable. Ava walked over, keeping her voice low. You knew, didn't you? Jordan didn't flinch. He just kept wiping down a plate, his grip a little too tight. Knew what? Ava took a quick glance around. Douglas was in his office. Brandon and Kyle were by the bar, probably planning their next move. She turned back to Jordan. That they're trying to take this place down. That Douglas is involved. Jordan's jaw clenched. Ain't my business. Ava narrowed her eyes. Bullshit. Jordan finally looked at her, his face tight. Look, I don't know who you are, but you need to drop this. You're new. You don't get it yet. Ava crossed her arms. Then help me get it. Jordan exhaled sharply, shaking his head. It's deeper than just those two clowns. You think they came up with this plan on their own? Please. Ava's stomach dropped. Who else? Jordan hesitated. Then quietly, too quietly, he said, This goes way past Douglas. Ava's pulse spiked. How far? Jordan gave her a hard look. Far enough that if you're not careful, you're going to regret asking. Ava held his stare. Then, just as he turned to walk away, he muttered, You want answers? Check the back office. And then he was gone. The office. Ava didn't hesitate. If there were answers, she was going to get them. The back office was locked, but that wasn't an issue. She'd been sneaking into places she wasn't supposed to be since she was 15. She glanced around. Empty hallway. Then, quick as lightning, she grabbed a fork off a nearby tray, slid it into the lock, and click. The door swung open. The office was small but too neat, too controlled. A desk, a filing cabinet, a security monitor showing camera feeds, and a laptop. Ava's heart pounded as she sat down, fingers flying over the keyboard. No password. Idiot. She clicked into recent emails, and that's when she found it. A thread between Douglas and someone named R. Hale. Douglas. It's moving faster than expected. The complaints are piling up. Another week, maybe two, and the board will have no choice but to act. R. Hale. Make sure it looks natural. We don't want any loose ends. Ava's blood ran cold. This wasn't just about taking down a restaurant. They were targeting her father. She barely had time to process before... Oh, what the hell do you think you're doing? Ava spun in the chair. Douglas stood in the doorway, fury in his eyes. And he wasn't alone. Brandon and Kyle flanked him, blocking the exit. Ava's heart slammed against her ribs. She had been caught. Ava's heart slammed against her ribs as she locked eyes with Douglas. She was caught. He stood in the doorway, his sharp blue eyes burning with something between fury and amusement. Brandon and Kyle flanked him, their smug, arrogant faces making her stomach turn. Ava forced herself to stay calm, even though her hands were still on the laptop. She had found enough in those emails to know this wasn't just about a restaurant failing. It was a full-scale takedown of her father's empire. And these guys, they were just the pawns. Douglas stepped into the office, closing the door behind him with a quiet, deliberate click. You're in the wrong place, sweetheart. His voice was low, measured. The kind of voice that said he wasn't worried. Ava sat back in the chair, crossing her arms like she hadn't just been caught red-handed. Funny. I was just about to say the same thing about you. Brandon let out a scoff. You got a real mouth on you, don't you? Ava didn't even look at him. Douglas moved closer, standing over her like a predator watching its prey. Now here's what's going to happen, he said smoothly. You're going to stand up, walk out of here, and forget whatever the hell you think you saw. Ava tilted her head, faking curiosity. And if I don't? Douglas's smirk didn't falter, but there was a flash of something darker in his eyes. Then we make sure you don't have a reason to come back tomorrow. Kyle chuckled. Ava's muscles tensed. She had been in high-stakes situations before, negotiating contracts, dealing with business sharks who wanted a piece of her father's empire. But this was different. She wasn't in a boardroom. She wasn't in her world. She was in theirs, and right now, they thought they had all the power. Ava slowly stood, her gaze never leaving Douglas's. You're making a mistake. Douglas actually laughed at that. No, sweetheart, you did. The moment you started asking questions. Ava took a step forward, just enough to close the distance between them. I don't think you get it, she said quietly, her voice laced with steel. You're not dealing with some scared little waitress. You're dealing with me. Douglas's smirk wavered for half a second. And that's when Ava made her move. The escape. Without warning, she slammed her elbow back into Kyle's gut. He let out a sharp grunt, stumbling. Before Brandon could react, Ava grabbed the closest thing she could, a metal clipboard off the desk, and swung it up into his face. Crack! Brandon staggered back, cursing. Douglas lunged for her. but Ava was already moving. She bolted for the door, yanked it open, and raced into the hallway. Behind her, she heard Douglas bark out orders. "Stop her!" But she wasn't stopping for anything. A few servers turned their heads as she sprinted past the kitchen, but no one moved to help. She hit the back door at full speed, bursting into the cool night air, but she wasn't free yet. She could hear footsteps behind her, Brandon and Kyle, right on her heels. Ava's breath burned in her lungs, but she kept going. She knew if they caught her, it wouldn't end well. She turned a sharp corner, ducking into a narrow alley. Trash bins, metal stairs, a dead end. Her heart pounded. And then, a voice. "Here!" She spun. Jordan. He was standing near the loading dock, holding up a set of keys. "Get in the damn car!" Ava didn't hesitate. She sprinted toward him, and the second she jumped into the passenger seat, Jordan hit the gas. Brandon and Kyle skidded around the corner just as the car peeled out. Too late. Ava looked back, breathless, as their figures faded into the night. She turned to Jordan, her chest still rising and falling. "How the hell did you—" Jordan shook his head, gripping the wheel tight. "Figured you might need a ride." Ava let out a short, disbelieving laugh. Then her expression hardened. "We have to go to my father. Now." Jordan nodded, the car roaring down the street. Because this wasn't just about a few bad employees anymore. This was war. And Ava Collins, she wasn't about to lose. The car sped through the city streets, tires screeching as Jordan weaved through traffic like a man who'd been running from trouble his whole life. The glow of streetlights flickered across Ava's face, but she wasn't paying attention to the road. She was thinking about Douglas, about Brandon and Kyle, about the emails, the sabotage, the way they had looked at her in that office like she was nothing. Big mistake. Jordan finally glanced at her, his grip tight on the wheel. "You gonna tell me what the hell that was back there?" Ava exhaled sharply, still feeling the adrenaline in her veins. "They're not just trash employees. They're trying to take my father down. And I'm not talking just this restaurant. This is bigger." Jordan let out a low whistle. "Damn, and here I was, thinking this job just sucked 'cause of the tips." Ava cracked a smirk, but it faded just as fast. "We need to get to my dad, now." Jordan nodded and pressed harder on the gas. Mark Collins sat in his office, staring out over the city he had built his empire in. A man like him didn't get to the top without knowing when something smelled off. And right now, everything stunk. So when his assistant cracked open the door, looking a little too nervous, he already knew something was coming. "Sir, your daughter is here, and she's not alone." Mark turned just as Ava stormed in, Jordan at her side. She didn't wait for permission. "Dad, you need to hear this." Mark eyed her for a long second, then motioned for her to sit. "Start talking." Ava laid it all out. She told him about the sabotage, about Douglas, about Brandon and Kyle intentionally tanking the restaurant's reputation, about the emails, the calls, the name that kept popping up, R. Hale. By the time she was done, her father wasn't just listening anymore. He was seething. Mark Collins was a man who built something from nothing. He'd clawed his way up, fought through every setback, every ounce of resistance. And now someone thought they could take it all away? Not on his watch. He stood up, adjusting his watch with slow precision. "Get in the car." Ava blinked. "Where are we?" He cut her off, his voice ice cold. "To the restaurant. If someone wants to destroy my business, they can try saying it to my face." When Mark Collins walked through the doors of Chateau Noir, the entire restaurant fell silent. Every server, bartender, and chef froze, as they recognized the man who signed their paychecks. Even the guests glanced up, sensing something big was happening. Ava followed at his side, Jordan a few steps behind. Douglas was at the host stand, chatting up some executive-looking type, when he turned and locked eyes with Mark. For the first time, Douglas didn't look so confident. "Mr. Collins," he started, putting on his fake corporate smile. "Didn't expect to see you here tonight." Mark's voice was dead calm. "Bring them out." Douglas blinked. "Excuse me?" Ava stepped forward, arms crossed. "Brandon. Kyle. Get them. Now." The room was so quiet you could hear the kitchen staff stop chopping. Douglas hesitated. But then, he saw the look on Mark's face. The game was over. A minute later, Brandon and Kyle were standing in the middle of the restaurant, looking a lot less cocky than usual. Mark glanced at Douglas. Let's take a little trip to the office. All of us. Inside the back office, Mark Collins leaned against the desk watching Douglas squirm under the weight of his own downfall. Ava stood beside him, arms crossed. Jordan was near the door watching for any sudden movements. Mark pulled out a tablet, tapped the screen, and played the email Ava had found. Douglas paled. Brandon and Kyle exchanged glances. Ava leaned in, voice dripping with satisfaction. Funny thing about sabotage, it always leaves a trail. Douglas opened his mouth to deny it, but before he could speak, Mark cut him off. I built this business from the ground up. I gave you a job, and this is how you repay me? Douglas swallowed hard. Look, Mark held up a hand, silencing him. Let me tell you how this is going to go. His voice was so calm it was terrifying. You're going to resign today. Brandon and Kyle, you're fired. Kyle scoffed. You can't just... Mark's gaze snapped to him, and the kid shut up real fast. Oh, I can, and I just did. Douglas tried one last play. If I go down, I won't go alone. Mark smiled, not a nice smile. A smile that said, You lost. You already did. He tapped the tablet again. Every conversation, every email, every move they had made. It was all recorded. Douglas deflated. Ava smirked. Guess you should have been smarter about covering your tracks. Douglas said nothing, because there was nothing left to say. That night, Douglas was gone. So were Brandon and Kyle. Mark made sure their names were blacklisted in every fine dining establishment in the city. Ava sat in his office, sipping a cup of coffee, finally letting herself breathe. Mark watched her for a long moment. So, you still think I don't know what's going on in my own business? Ava smirked. Nah, but you gotta admit, I was right about this one. Mark chuckled. Then he leaned back, studying her. You ever think about running this company one day? Ava blinked. That was unexpected. She set down her coffee, thinking, and for the first time she wasn't so sure of her answer. Maybe. Just maybe. Ava leaned back in her chair, letting the weight of the past few days finally settle. The tension in her shoulders, the fire in her chest, it was still there. But now it felt different, controlled, focused. Her father sat across from her, his gaze unreadable, the way it always was when he was thinking 5 moves ahead. But this time there was something else in his expression, something quieter. Pride. Mark exhaled, setting his empty coffee cup down. You thought this was just a game, didn't you? Ava smirked, shaking her head. At first, Mark studied her, then leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk. You didn't just find the problem, Ava, you fixed it. Ava felt her chest tighten. He wasn't just talking about the restaurant. He was talking about something bigger. She had stepped into his world, not as his daughter, but as someone who could actually make a difference. Mark reached into his desk and pulled out a folder, sliding it across the table. Ava frowned, glancing down at it. What's this? Your next move, if you want it. She hesitated before flipping it open. Inside were documents, internal reports, financial breakdowns, confidential records from across his entire empire. Her breath caught. This wasn't just another restaurant problem. This was everything. Ava looked up at her father, searching his face. You're serious. Mark gave her that dangerous smirk, the one that had built an empire. You think I'd waste my time otherwise? Ava's fingers traced the edge of the folder, her mind racing. She had spent her life running from this world, convinced she didn't belong in it. But now she wasn't so sure. She closed the folder, gripping it tight. Guess I should start reading. Mark nodded, standing up. You've got work to do. Ava watched as he walked toward the door, pausing just before stepping out. One last thing, he said, glancing back. You've proven you can fight, Ava, but winning? That's a whole different game. And then he was gone. Ava sat there for a long moment, staring at the folder in her hands. She came here for the truth. She found it. But maybe, just maybe, she had found something else too. A future. A purpose. And a battle that was just beginning. She smirked to herself, flipping open the folder again. Let the games begin.